The galaxy had survived empires. It had survived Death Stars, Sith Lords, and the slow rot of political collapse. It had survived things that should have ended it a dozen times over, and each time the survivors rebuilt, mourned, and told themselves that the worst was behind them. They were wrong, of course. They were always wrong. But this time, the thing that proved them wrong did not come from within the galaxy at all. It came from somewhere else entirely. The dimensional rift opened without warning approximately 40,000 kilometers off the port bow of a First-Order Resurgent-class star destroyer, the Implacable, which was conducting routine hyperspace lane surveillance in the Outer Rim's Quellahin Nebula. Lieutenant Henna Vaz, a young signals officer 17 months into her first deep space posting, was the first person in the galaxy to see it. She described it later, in the deposition she gave before her summary reassignment to a mining outpost, as a tear. Not a metaphorical tear, a literal one, as though the black fabric of space had been gripped by invisible hands and pulled apart, revealing something behind it that burned cold and white and wrong. Through the tear came a ship. It was enormous. Not Star Destroyer enormous, not the clean, angular brutalism of First-Order engineering, but enormous in the way that ancient things are enormous, carrying weight that has nothing to do with physical mass. Its hull was dark metal the color of dried blood, etched with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly, ornate and threatening in equal measure. Towers rose from its spine like the architecture of a fever dream, and at its prow, mounted like the figurehead of some terrible sailing vessel from a dead civilization's mythology, was a face cast in that same dark metal, angular, imperious, cruel even in effigy. The ship had no designation that any First-Order database could match. Its energy signature corresponded to no known propulsion system. Its hull composition defeated every sensor sweep the Implacable could run. It hung in space, listing slightly to the starboard, and did not respond to hails. General Rorik Fenn, commanding officer of the Implacable, was a careful man. Careful men rise through First-Order ranks precisely because they do not make mistakes that attract attention, and Fenn had spent 20 years perfecting the art of measured, decisive caution. He ordered 3 TIE squadrons scrambled. He ordered long-range sensors at maximum sensitivity. He opened a priority channel to the nearest First-Order command installation and began composing a report in language that accurately conveyed the severity of the situation without conveying his own considerable alarm. He did not order an attack. The ship was damaged. That much was clear from the debris field trailing it, the scarring along its flanks that suggested catastrophic structural stress, the flickering quality of what might have been a defensive energy screen struggling to maintain coherence. A damaged ship was not an immediate threat. A damaged ship was an intelligence opportunity. General Fenn was a careful man, and careful men do not destroy opportunities. He should have destroyed the opportunity. Deep within the alien vessel, in a command chamber that smelled of ozone and something older and stranger, the man who called himself Ming the Merciless stood before a viewport and studied the First-Order Star Destroyer with eyes that had been studying enemies for longer than most civilizations had existed. He was tall, dressed in robes of midnight blue and silver that moved like liquid when he turned. His face a composition of sharp angles and absolute certainty. His eyes dark and depthless beneath the severe arch of his brow. On his right hand, a ring of extraordinary craftsmanship pulsed with contained energy. He wore the expression of a man who had expected this. He had not expected this. He had expected the rift to be temporary, a side effect of his weapons test against the rebel fleet that had been harassing Mongo's eastern territories. He had expected, at worst, to lose a few escort vessels to spatial distortion. He had not expected the rift to pull his flagship, the Imperatrix, 11 vessels of his personal guard fleet, and approximately 40,000 of his most loyal soldiers, through whatever dimensional seam had just deposited them in this unknown region of space. He turned from the viewport. "Report," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that rooms obeyed. Commander Tarnak, his chief strategic officer, a man who had survived Ming's service for 19 years by being both brilliant and utterly without pride, straightened from his console. "My lord, we have lost the Rendak, the Vora's 3 of the escort cruisers, and all but one of the fighter complement bays. The Imperatrix herself sustained significant damage during transit. Hull integrity is at 63%. Our long-range communications array is non-functional. Short-range sensors are operational. The rift. Closed, my lord. There is no measurable trace of it remaining. Ming absorbed this. He turned back to the viewport, to the large angular warship hanging in space before them, to the smaller craft it had launched, fighters, clearly, though of a design he had never encountered, that were now circling his damaged flagship in careful, predatory arcs. He was in an unknown location. His fleet was crippled. He could not communicate with Mongo. He could not, apparently, return. He studied the Star Destroyer. It was a warship built by people who understood power. The lines spoke of industrial-scale violence, of a civilization that had learned to project force across vast distances and had made that projection the center of its identity. He recognized the philosophy immediately because he had built an empire on it himself. Whoever commanded that vessel believed that the ship size and weaponry were argument enough. They believed that the implicit threat of overwhelming force was communication. Ming understood this language fluently. "They're hailing us," Tarnak reported. "The signal is in a language our translators cannot yet parse." However, he paused, running calculations. The mathematical structure of the transmission suggests a standard first contact protocol. They're identifying themselves and requesting identification in return. How long to translate their language? Given the signal volume we're receiving passively from surrounding space, there appear to be many transmissions in the same language. Our systems estimate 90 minutes to functional basic comprehension, 6 hours to operational fluency. Ming nodded once. "Do not respond. Continue passive collection and begin repairs immediately. I want weapons online within the hour." "My lord," Tarnak said carefully, "their fighters are maintaining close formation around us. If we begin powering weapons, then we will learn something useful about their response protocols." Ming's voice contained no particular concern. "Either they will attack, in which case we know they are enemies of limited patience, or they will not, in which case we know they want something from us more than they want us destroyed. Either answer is information." He paused. "Have the medical bay prepare my chambers." The transit was taxing. He did not elaborate. Ming the Merciless did not elaborate on weakness to subordinates. But as he turned from the viewport, a hand moved briefly to his temple, and for just a moment that Tarnak was professionally wise enough to not appear to notice, the Emperor of Mongo closed his eyes against something that might have been pain. The dimensional transit had cost him something. He wasn't sure yet what. His ring's energy reserves were depleted to an uncomfortable degree. His psychic faculties, always his sharpest instrument, felt muffled, as though he were hearing the world through heavy cloth. This galaxy had a different quality to its ambient energy than anything he had encountered. It pressed against his consciousness in ways he couldn't yet classify. He would classify it. He classified everything. He opened his eyes. The Star Destroyer filled his viewport, vast and certain of itself. Ming almost smiled. It had been a long time since anything had presented him with a genuinely novel problem. He found, beneath the cold calculation, something he rarely permitted himself: the faint, dangerous warmth of interest. The galaxy had no idea what had just arrived. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. General Fenn's report reached First Order High Command in just under 4 hours, which was either a testament to First Order communication efficiency or a reflection of how aggressively his signals officer had flagged the transmission's priority level. By the time it reached the hands of people who mattered, it had accumulated annotations from 3 separate intelligence analysts, 2 xenotechnology specialists who had been hastily pulled from other assignments, and 1 very alarmed admiral who had added a single line in red. Asterisk, this is not a known vessel configuration from any mapped region of the galaxy. Recommend immediate escalation to Supreme Leader. Asterisk. The recommendation was followed. Most recommendations regarding the Supreme Leader were followed, because the alternative was the kind of career outcome that ended careers in the permanent sense. Snoke received the report in his throne room aboard the Supremacy, seated in the manner of a man who had long ago stopped needing to perform power because he simply was it. He read Fenn's report once. He read the analyst's annotations. He set the data aside and sat for a long moment in silence. And in that silence he reached out with something that had nothing to do with technology or signal arrays or any instrument that could be calibrated and measured and reported on. He reached out with the Force. What he found gave even Snoke pause. There was a presence in the Quellahan Nebula that didn't belong. Not in the way that dark side users didn't belong. Snoke was intimately familiar with that particular flavor of wrongness, had cultivated it in himself and in Kylo Ren with deliberate, patient craft. This was different. This presence existed adjacent to the Force rather than within it, like a stone dropped into still water. The Force rippled around it, responded to it, but couldn't penetrate it. The mind at the center of that presence was extraordinary. Layered, ancient, disciplined in ways that suggested decades of conscious mental cultivation, and utterly, completely alien to anything the Force had ever encountered in this galaxy. Snoke probed deeper. The mind pushed back. It was not a Force-sensitive push. It was something else, a structured psychic resistance that operated on principles Snoke didn't immediately recognize. Built from the inside out like a fortress whose architect had anticipated siege from every possible angle. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, Snoke pressed against it, mapping its contours, testing its weak points with the casual confidence of a being who had broken stronger minds than any in the known galaxy. Then the fortress pushed back with interest. Snoke withdrew. Not quickly, he was too disciplined for panic, but deliberately reassessing. He sat with the information for a moment. The presence in the Quellahan Nebula had felt his probe, had recognized it for what it was, and had responded not with fear or confusion, but with a measured counter-pressure of someone who had been probed before and had spent considerable time preparing for the next attempt. This was not a creature that would be easily manipulated. Snoke found this considerably more interesting than threatening, which said something about Snoke. He summoned Kylo Ren. Kylo arrived still carrying the particular charged atmosphere that followed him everywhere in those months, the barely contained volatility, the grief worn as armor, the darkness that was genuine but also performed, as though he was always slightly aware of an audience even when alone. He stood before Snoke's throne and received the briefing without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. A ship from outside the galaxy, Kylo said. From outside this dimension, if the rift data is accurate, Snoke corrected, with the gentle precision of a teacher who finds a student's error instructive, which makes the being aboard at something genuinely unprecedented. The Force exists in all living things in this galaxy. It did not exist where this being came from. Then he's Force blind. No connection to the Force at all. No connection to the Force as we understand it, Snoke said. That is not the same thing. Do not make the mistake of equating unfamiliarity with weakness, my child. It is a mistake I suspect this being has caused many others to make, to their considerable regret. He paused. I want to know what he is. I want to know what his technology can do. And I want to know whether he can be useful. Kylo's expression moved through something complicated. And if he can't be useful, then the Quellahan Nebula will have one more debris field. Kylo was dispatched with a full complement of escorts and orders that balanced the appearance of diplomatic contact with the practical reality of overwhelming force. Snoke watched him go with the expression of a man moving pieces on a board, then turned back to his viewport and the vast, cold dark of space, and reached out one more time toward that presence in the nebula. It was waiting for him. He could feel it, patient, watchful, entirely unafraid. Snoke withdrew again. He permitted himself the luxury of a thought he would never have spoken aloud. Whoever was aboard that ship had lived a very long time, had conquered a great deal, and had survived things that should have killed him. They had that in common, at least. Ming, for his part, had spent those same 4 hours doing what he did best, learning. His translation systems had achieved functional comprehension of the dominant galactic language in 80 minutes, ahead of Tarnak's estimate, partly because Ming had personally supervised the algorithmic prioritization, and partly because Ming's personal intellect, even muffled by the transit's aftereffects, operated at a level that made most computer systems feel like they were being supervised by their own creator. He now understood the basic political architecture of the galaxy he had arrived in. A conflict between a militaristic authoritarian order, called the First Order, and a ragtag resistance movement backed by the remnants of something called the New Republic, which appeared to have been recently and catastrophically destroyed. He understood the technology broadly, faster-than-light travel via something called hyperspace, energy weapons, shields, a class of warrior mystics who wielded something called the Force through elegant plasma-bladed weapons. He understood the economics. A galaxy of countless inhabited systems, enormous resource wealth, trade routes and criminal networks, and political factions layered over each other in the complex ecology of a civilization that had been at war with itself, in one form or another, for generations. He sat with all of this and did what tyrants who survive long enough always learn to do. He thought about it structurally. Not about what he wanted, he always knew what he wanted, but about what the situation actually was, stripped of what he might prefer it to be. He was, at present, weak. His fleet was damaged. His people were tired and disoriented. He had no supply lines, no political relationships, no intelligence networks, no established reputation in this galaxy. He was, by any objective measure, in a position of vulnerability. This was a temporary condition. He had been in positions of vulnerability before. The methodology for exiting them was always the same. Identify who holds power, identify what they want, determine whether they can be used or must be destroyed, and proceed accordingly. The First Order held power, or at least a significant portion of it. They wanted, he reviewed the intercepted transmissions again, dominance, compliance, the erasure of resistance. They were, in philosophical terms, very much like him. This did not make them potential allies. If anything, it made them more dangerous. Two tyrants in the same territory do not cooperate. They compete. When the First Order fleet arrived, one massive command vessel and a substantial escort, emerging from hyperspace with the theatrical confidence of people accustomed to being the most powerful thing in any given situation, Ming was standing at his viewport, dressed in fresh robes, the transit's exhaustion nowhere visible on his face. He watched the fleet arrange itself with professional appreciation for the display of force, and then he did something that surprised Tarnak considerably. He hailed them first. "This is Ming," he said in their language, which he had been practicing for 40 minutes, and now spoke with only the faintest trace of an accent he had chosen deliberately, enough foreignness to seem authentic, not enough to seem weak. "Emperor of Mongo, Lord of the Universe I have come from, and your new neighbor." A pause calibrated to let that land. "I suggest we speak. I have found that the alternative to conversation is invariably more expensive for everyone involved." In the command shuttle descending toward the Imperatrix with a full night of an escort, Kylo Ren felt something through the Force, not the alien presence exactly, but the shape it left in the Force around it, the way a dark planet is visible by the stars it blocks. Whatever was aboard that ship had just made a move. He wasn't sure yet what kind. He reached for his lightsaber and didn't draw it. Not yet. But soon. The shuttle bay of the Imperatrix was designed to intimidate. Ming had built every throne room, every reception hall, every public space he had ever occupied with the same foundational principle. The architecture should do half the work before a single word is spoken. The bay's ceiling soared 40 meters overhead, its walls lined with ranks of Ming's Imperial Guard in their ceremonial armor, dark, angular, visored, standing with the absolute stillness of soldiers who had learned that movement without permission was a career-ending offense. Banks of cold blue lighting threw everything into sharp relief and deep shadow simultaneously. At the far end of the bay, on a raised platform approached by 17 steps, Ming had counted them personally during the design phase. 17 was enough to make a visitor feel the climb without being theatrical about it. Stood a single chair that stopped just short of being a throne. Ming stood beside it rather than sitting in it. He had found, over the centuries, that standing conveyed more confidence than sitting. Seated rulers looked like they were waiting. Standing rulers looked like they had already decided. Kylo Ren came down the shuttle's ramp with 3 Knights of Ren flanking him and stopped at the base of the 17 steps. He was tall, broad-shouldered, masked. The mask was interesting. Ming noted a psychological construction as much as a practical one. The face hidden to prevent the face from being read. And he radiated the particular energy of someone carrying enormous power imperfectly controlled. Ming had known men like this. Talented, dangerous, volatile. The most useful kind, if handled correctly. The most destructive kind, if not. Ming descended the steps. Not all of them. He stopped at the 5th from the bottom, which put him at eye level with Kylo Ren rather than below him. An equality of physical position that was also a statement about the limits of that equality. He studied the masked face for a moment with the patience of a man who had been studying faces for 400 years. "You're not the one in charge," Ming said. A beat. The Knights of Ren shifted almost imperceptibly. Kylo's stillness took on a different quality. Not offense, exactly, but the sharp attention of someone recalibrating. "I represent Supreme Leader Snoke," Kylo said. His voice through the mask was deep, controlled, carrying an edge that most people would have found unsettling. Ming found it informative. "Of course you do." Ming turned and walked back up to his platform with measured, unhurried steps. "Come. We will speak." He did not add "if you like" or "please" or any of the softening qualifiers that people appended to invitations when they weren't sure of their ground. It was a command dressed as a courtesy, and whether Kylo Ren recognized it as such would tell Ming something important. Kylo followed. He left the Knights of Ren at the base of the steps, which told Ming something else. Either the young man was confident enough in his own abilities to meet alone, or he was making a deliberate show of confidence he wasn't entirely certain of. Either way, interesting. They sat across a narrow table in the chamber adjoining the shuttle bay. Ming had chosen it specifically because it was not his primary command center, not his personal quarters, not any space that would give a guest intelligence about his actual capabilities or resources. It was a neutral room, furnished austerely, containing nothing of value except the conversation itself. Kylo Ren removed his mask. Ming had not expected that. He catalogued the face quickly. Young, scarred, the scar new, and still carrying emotional weight, eyes that wanted to be colder than they were. A man at war with himself as much as with anyone else. This was either a vulnerability or a strength depending entirely on which side of himself one. "Supreme Leader Snoke wishes to know your intentions," Kylo said. "And you?" Ming asked. "What do you wish to know?" "The same thing." "No," Ming said gently. "You don't. Snoke wants to assess whether I'm a threat or a resource. You want to know whether I'm something that can teach you something." He watched Kylo's face and saw the flicker, just a flicker, of accurate recognition. "You felt my presence through your force. You're curious about something that exists outside it." He folded his hands on the table, the ring on his right hand catching the light. "That's an honest impulse. I respect honest impulses." "What is that?" Kylo's eyes were on the ring. "A tool." Ming turned his hand slightly. The ring pulsed once, a contained surge of golden energy that moved across its surface like heat lightning. "Among the most sophisticated tools my civilization ever produced. It focuses and amplifies certain personal capabilities. What you would call psychic abilities, I believe, though the terminology your galaxy uses is imprecise for what it actually does. You're not force sensitive. I am not connected to your force, no. I have my own relationship with the energies of consciousness and will. The force is your galaxy's mechanism. It is not the only one that exists." Ming paused. "Though I will say it is the most pervasive ambient energy field I have ever encountered. Your galaxy is saturated with it in a way that is quite remarkable." Kylo leaned forward slightly, and Ming recognized the gesture, the involuntary lean of genuine interest overcoming trained composure. "Snoke attempted to probe your mind." "I know." You pushed back. "Naturally. He doesn't fail at that." The words came out carrying more weight than a simple statement of fact. There was something personal in them, the particular resonance of someone who had experienced that not failing firsthand. "He didn't fail," Ming said. "He withdrew. There's a difference." A man who fails has been defeated. A man who withdraws has chosen to gather more information before his next attempt. He held Kylo's gaze steadily. Your supreme leader is intelligent. He recognized that what he encountered required a different approach. That is a sign of capability, not weakness. He allowed a small pause. Whether his next approach will be more successful is a separate question. The silence that followed was the most useful kind of silence, the kind where both parties are thinking rather than just waiting for the other to speak. Then Snoke made his move. Not physically. Snoke was not present in the room, was in fact millions of kilometers away aboard the Supremacy, but through Kylo, through the bond between them, through whatever mechanism of force manipulation Snoke had developed for precisely this purpose. Ming felt at the moment it began, a pressure, not at his psychic defenses this time, but at the edges of the room's atmosphere itself, a subtle force compulsion directed at Kylo. Press him, probe him, find the weakness. That Snoke clearly expected would be invisible to anyone not force-sensitive. Ming was not force-sensitive. He felt it anyway. Not through the Force, but through 400 years of reading power dynamics in rooms, 400 years of sensing the invisible strings that connected puppets to their operators. He looked at Kylo Ren with something that, in anyone else's face, might have been sympathy. He's listening through you right now, isn't he? Ming said. It was not a question. Kylo's jaw tightened. Everything I observe is available to the Supreme Leader through R. He's not just observing, he's directing. Ming leaned back slightly, addressing the room as much as the young man across from him. Supreme Leader, I appreciate the efficiency. There is no need for intermediaries. He touched his ring, and the pulse of energy that moved through it was different this time. Not a display, but a function, a careful, precisely targeted pulse of psychic energy that Ming directed not at Kylo Ren, but at the force connection between Kylo and Snoke, pressing against that channel like a finger pressed against a wire carrying current. Aboard the Supremacy, Snoke felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt his own connection to Kylo Ren, a connection he had spent years weaving, strand by strand, through Kylo's emotional wounds and desperate hunger for meaning. Suddenly acquire a new variable. Something was touching it from the other end, not breaking it, not even threatening it, just touching it, with the exploratory precision of a scientist examining a sample. Snoke broke the active connection immediately and sat forward in his throne. In the meeting room aboard the Imperatrix, Kylo Ren blinked, the blink of someone whose background noise had suddenly ceased, and stared at Ming with an expression that had moved cleanly past trained composure into something raw. What did you just do? Kylo asked. I introduced myself to your Supreme Leader properly, Ming said. He was being rude. He straightened his robes with a gesture of absolute composure. Now, shall we have an honest conversation, or shall we continue performing for an audience that is no longer watching? The intelligence report reached Leia Organa in pieces, the way most useful intelligence did, not as a clean, complete briefing delivered by someone with good posture and a prepared summary, but as fragments arriving through mismatched channels at inconvenient hours, each piece individually insufficient and collectively alarming. The first fragment came from a resistance slicer who had been running a passive tap on First-Order Fleet communications for 11 months, and had flagged an unusual volume of encrypted priority traffic originating from the Quellahan Nebula. The second came from a merchant captain named Sorval, who ran supply routes through the Outer Rim and had seen, with his own eyes, a ship he could not identify hanging damaged in space near the nebula's edge, while First-Order vessels clustered around it with a particular body language of predators, deciding whether something was prey or poison. The third fragment, the one that made Leia set down her CAF and give the report her complete attention, came from a First-Order lieutenant named D.A.V. Marek, who had been feeding the Resistance selective intelligence for 8 months in exchange for extraction promises that the Resistance kept meaning to fulfill. Marek's fragment was 3 sentences. Unknown vessel arrived through dimensional rift. Occupant is a foreign emperor with psychic abilities and advanced technology. Kylo Ren returned from first contact without information and without the prisoner Snoke wanted. Supreme Leader is furious. That was 4 sentences, Leia noted. Marek had never been good at counting under stress. She read the 3 fragments together twice, then set them down and looked at the water-stained ceiling of the Resistance's current base, a requisition facility on a moon that smelled permanently of industrial lubricant, and thought about what they meant with the careful, unsentimental rigor that 30 years of fighting impossible odds had taught her. She had learned to separate what she felt about a situation from what the situation actually was. She felt, reading these fragments, a complex mixture of concern and the particular dark interest that came from recognizing a variable that could change the entire calculation of a conflict. What the situation actually was required more information. She called a meeting with the people whose judgment she trusted, which at this stage of the Resistance's existence was a shorter list than she would have liked. "A foreign emperor," said Admiral Akbar, who had heard worse things in his life but was visibly filing this one near the top of the list. "From another dimension, if Merrick's report is accurate," Leia said. "Merrick's reports are accurate 68% of the time," said Cait Elkonix, who tracked these things. 68% is high enough to act on when the alternative is acting on nothing, Leia said. "The question isn't whether to believe it. The question is what it means and what we do about it." What it meant occupied the next hour. The Resistance in its current state had limited resources, limited personnel, and the chronic strategic disadvantage of fighting a larger, better supplied enemy on ground of that enemy's choosing. The arrival of an unknown power with unknown capabilities and unknown intentions was, on the surface, simply one more complication in a situation that was already critically complicated. But Leia had not survived the destruction of Alderaan, the Battle of Yavin, the fall of the New Republic, and everything in between by treating complications as purely negative. A complication for the First Order could be an opportunity for the Resistance. The calculus depended entirely on what this foreign emperor wanted. "If he's as dangerous as the report implies," said a Resistance intelligence officer named Brents, "the First Order might be able to use him. New technology, psychic abilities, an alliance with an outside power, any of those individually would be a problem for us. All 3 together." "He won't ally with the First Order," Leia said. The certainty in her voice made several people look at her. She paused, examining it herself. "I don't have hard intelligence for that. It's a reading." But a man who came through that meeting with Kylo Ren without giving Snoke what Snoke wanted, who apparently did something that broke Snoke's force connection mid-conversation. That's not a man who's looking for a patron. That's a man who's deciding whether the First Order is useful to him. She picked up Merrick's fragment again. "Snoke is furious because he expected to be in control of this situation, and he isn't. That tells us something about who we're dealing with." "It tells us he's dangerous," Akbar said. "It tells us he's independent," Leia corrected. "Dangerous and independent is very different from dangerous and aligned against us. The first is manageable. The second is not." She set the report down. "I want contact. Carefully, indirectly, through channels that don't expose our location. I want to know what he wants and whether there's any version of this where his interests and ours don't conflict." The room was quiet for a moment with a specific quality of quiet that meant people were thinking about how to say that sounds extremely risky to someone who had stopped being deterred by extremely risky approximately 3 decades ago. "And if his interests do conflict with ours?" Brents asked. "Then we'll know that too," Leia said. "And we'll plan accordingly." She did not say what she was actually thinking, which was that she had felt something when she read the report. Not through intelligence analysis or strategic reasoning, but through the Force, which she had never fully trained, but had never fully ignored either. That quiet, persistent sense that had guided her through the worst moments of her life, toward something she couldn't always see clearly, but could always, if she was honest, feel. What she had felt reading about the man in the Quellahan Nebula was not threat and not opportunity, but something more ambiguous and more interesting than either. She had felt recognition. Not of the man himself, but of the shape of him. Someone who had held power absolutely for so long that power had become simply the medium he existed in, like water to a creature that had never known anything else. She knew what that did to people. She had watched it happen to her father, in the terrible slow way that darkness takes hold. She had watched it happen to the Empire, to the First Order, to every structure that confused domination with order. But she had also watched, in rarer cases, what happened to people who held that kind of power and somewhere, beneath all the accumulated weight of it, retained something else. Some contrary current. She didn't know yet whether this man had that. She intended to find out. The Resistance's contact attempt, when it came, arrived at the Imperatrix through the most indirect channel available. A message encoded in a commercial shipping frequency, addressed to no one, containing what appeared on the surface to be routine cargo manifests. The encoding was sophisticated, not first-order sophisticated, but the particular clever sophistication of people who had been hiding messages inside ordinary noise for decades because their survival depended on it. Ming's cryptography team flagged it within 20 minutes. Ming decoded it himself within 10, partly because his personal intellect operated well above his cryptography team's level, and partly because he recognized the underlying methodology as one he had used himself in an earlier century, when Mongo's resistance movements had been more of a genuine threat. The message, stripped of its concealment, was 8 words. "We know you're here. We'd like to talk." Ming read it 3 times. Then he looked at Tarnak. "The Resistance," he said. It was not a question. He had been building his intelligence picture of the galaxy's political landscape for 2 days now, and the Resistance's existence, methods, and approximate capabilities were already charted in his understanding. Not the First Order. The other ones. "Yes, my lord." "Interesting." Ming set the decoded message down and picked up the ring, turning it slowly in his fingers, not wearing it, just holding it, a habit he had when thinking. "The First Order knows I'm here and responds by sending an enforcer to attempt control. The Resistance knows I'm here and responds by making contact through a channel that reveals almost nothing about their location or capabilities." He set the ring down. Which of those responses suggests greater intelligence? Tarnak, who had survived 19 years of Ming service, recognized a rhetorical question and wisely said nothing. "Draft a response," Ming said. "Same channel, same encoding methodology. Tell them I am willing to speak." He paused. "Tell them to send someone who has actual authority to negotiate. I have no interest in intermediaries." He picked up the ring again and slid it onto his finger, and the pulse of energy that moved through it had something almost anticipatory in its quality. "And tell them to come alone." He turned back to his viewport. Outside, the First Order's surveillance vessels maintained their careful distance, watching the Imperatrix with the patient attention of predators who had decided to wait rather than act. Ming watched them back. 2 powers had now made contact with him. One through force and manipulation. One through careful intelligence and a request. Both wanted something from him. Both would, in time, attempt to use him for their own ends. Ming found this profoundly familiar. More importantly, he found it useful. In a galaxy he didn't yet own, being wanted was the next best thing to being powerful. And, in his experience, the gap between those 2 conditions closed faster than most people expected. He had, after all, closed it before. The Outer Rim existed in the Star Wars galaxy the way it always had and always would, as a place where the galaxy's official power structures thinned to something closer to suggestion than law, where the distance between any given inhabited system and the nearest First Order patrol route could be measured in days of hyperspace travel, and where the practical question of who was in charge of any particular station, port, or planetoid was answered less by political authority than by who showed up with enough muscle to make the question irrelevant. It was, in other words, the kind of environment that Ming the Merciless understood at a cellular level, because he had built Mongo's criminal and political underclass from exactly this kind of raw material. Desperate people in lawless places who needed someone to organize their desperation into something useful. He arrived at Vorith Station in a shuttle, not his personal shuttle, too identifiable, too obviously connected to the Imperatrix, which was still sitting in the Quellahan Nebula under Tarnak's command, running repairs and maintaining the careful fiction of immobility that kept the First Order's surveillance vessels complacent. This shuttle was a requisitioned cargo hauler, old enough to be invisible and functional enough to be credible, manned by 6 of Ming's Imperial Guard in civilian clothes that fit them with the particular wrongness of uniforms worn by people who had never worn anything else. Ming himself had made one concession to disguise. He had exchanged his robes for something darker and less ornate, though the ring remained on his finger, because removing it would have been a tactical disadvantage he was unwilling to accept. Voristation was a joint venture between 3 criminal syndicates who had arrived at cooperation through the time-honored mechanism of mutual exhaustion after a territorial conflict that had left all 3 too weak to fight each other anymore. It hung in space at the junction of 2 moderately trafficked trade routes, smelled of recycled atmosphere and spilled Corellian ale, and conducted approximately 40% of its business in commodities that would have attracted regulatory attention if anyone with regulatory authority had been within several parsecs. The remaining 60% was the kind of legitimate commerce that provided cover for the first 40. Ming had identified it as a useful first contact point through 3 days of careful intelligence analysis, cross-referencing intercepted communications with shipping manifests and the behavioral patterns of the station's most frequent visitors. He walked its main corridor with the measured pace of a man who had walked the corridors of power for centuries, and found that the corridors of criminal enterprise were, functionally, very similar. Power concentrated in the same ways regardless of the setting. People arranged themselves around it in the same patterns. The signals were universal: who held eye contact and who looked away, who moved through crowds and who moved around them, which doorways had guards whose attention was too focused, and which tables had occupants whose attention was too casual. He found the man he was looking for at a table near the back of the station's largest cantina, which was not an inspired location for a private meeting, but was, Ming conceded, traditional. Ross the Hutt was not, by Hutt standards, particularly large, which meant he was still larger than most other species found comfortable to be in close proximity to. He was perhaps a century old, which made him young by Hutt standards, impulsive, ambitious, not yet calcified into the patient, immovable confidence that the older Hutts wore like second skin. He controlled 6 systems worth of smuggling operations, 3 moderately profitable spice routes, and a bounty hunting network that Ming's intelligence suggested was more competently managed than most. He was, in other words, precisely the kind of mid-level criminal power broker that Ming needed. Significant enough to be useful, not so entrenched that he would be difficult to maneuver. Ming sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation. One of Ross's bodyguards moved forward. Ming looked at the bodyguard with an expression that contained no threat whatsoever. No anger, no aggression, nothing that could be called hostile. And the bodyguard stopped anyway, stopped at the involuntary certainty of someone whose hindbrain had processed something their forebrain hadn't quite caught up to yet. Ming's ring pulsed once, barely perceptibly, against his finger. "You received my communication," Ming said, in the language he had been speaking for 4 days now, with an accent he had chosen carefully. Foreign enough to be memorable, controlled enough to be authoritative. Ross studied him with the amber eyes that Hutts used to assess everything: threat level, profit potential, and the complex relationship between the two. "You're the one from outside," Ross said. His basic carried the thick Huttese undertone that most Hutts didn't bother to train out. "The one the First Order is watching." "The one the First Order is failing to watch effectively," Ming corrected pleasantly. "I am here, after all, and they don't know it." A slow blink from Ross. "What do you want?" "The same thing you want," Ming said. "To be less vulnerable than I currently am, and more powerful than I currently appear. The methods are the flexible part." He folded his hands on the table, the ring visible, and watched Ross's eyes go to it with the involuntary attention that valuable things attracted invaluable people. "You run 6 systems. You have networks, contacts, routes, and relationships that took decades to build. You also have the problem that every independent operator in this galaxy has. You exist at the tolerance of powers larger than yourself, and that tolerance is contingent on your remaining small enough not to threaten them." He paused. "I am proposing to change that calculation." "You're one damaged ship," Ross said. Not unkindly, it was a statement of fact delivered by someone who dealt in facts for a living. "The First Order has thousands. The First Order has thousands of ships crewed by soldiers who follow orders because they fear the consequences of not following them," Ming said. "There's a meaningful difference between an army held together by fear and one held together by genuine loyalty and adequate compensation." The First Order's model has a structural weakness built into it. He tilted his head slightly. I have technologies your galaxy has never encountered. I have expertise in the administration of large-scale criminal and political enterprises that span centuries. And I have, at the moment, an urgent need for the kind of resources and local knowledge that your networks can provide. He met Vross's eyes directly. I am not asking you to fight the First Order. I am asking you to do business with me. The conflict with the First Order, if it comes, will be a consequence of that business rather than its purpose. Vross was quiet for a moment. The slow, considering quiet of a creature whose species had been conducting negotiations since before humans had discovered agriculture. And what do I get? Protection, Ming said. Real protection, not the kind that lasts until a larger predator appears. My technology integrated into your operations, communications, defensive systems, intelligence gathering, and a seat at a table that is going to become considerably more important than the one you're currently sitting at. He let that settle. I am going to need a base of operations in this region. I am going to need supply chains, repair facilities, and personnel. I am going to need introductions to the people who actually run things in the Outer Rim, as opposed to the people who believe they run things. He glanced around the cantina with the mild expression of a man who has assessed his surroundings and found them precisely as expected. You can provide all of that. Can, Vross said. Does it mean will? No, Ming agreed. It doesn't. He reached into his robe and set a data chip on the table between them. That contains schematics for a communications encryption system that your current technology cannot crack and the First Orders cannot crack either. A gift demonstrating good faith and capability simultaneously. He stood. I will return in 48 hours. You will have decided by then. If the answer is yes, we begin immediately. If the answer is no, he smoothed his robes, unhurried. Then I will find someone else who is less cautious and more ambitious. And in 6 months you will hear about them and wonder what might have been different. He walked out of the cantina with the same measured pace he had entered it, his guards falling in around him with the trained precision of soldiers who had been doing this for decades. And behind him, Vross the Hutt sat very still for a long moment, looking at the data chip, then pick it up. It took him 11 minutes to decrypt the basic architecture of the encryption system. He got that far before his own cryptography systems hit the first of 17 layered security protocols and stopped making progress. He sat looking at the results for a while longer, the amber eyes moving slowly. He sent a message to 3 of his most trusted lieutenants. The message said, "Find out everything there is to know about the ship in the Quellihan Nebula. Everything. I want it in 24 hours. Then he set the data chip down carefully, as though it might do something if handled roughly, and thought about the man who had just sat across from him with the absolute composure of someone who had never in his life been the least powerful entity in a room and did not intend to start now. Meanwhile, in the deeper Outer Rim, word was beginning to move through the channels that words moved through in places where official communication was a luxury. The informal networks of smugglers and bounty hunters and station operators and the 1,000 categories of people who lived in the spaces between the galaxy's official power structures. The word was fragmented and often inaccurate, as such words tended to be, but its core was consistent. Something new had arrived. Something from outside. Something the First Order was watching and hadn't managed to control yet. In the places where people made their livings by correctly identifying which way the wind was changing before everyone else did. This information was received with the careful, hungry attention it deserved. The galaxy's power structure had been static for long enough that most people in the Outer Rim had made their peace with its parameters. The First Order was vast and brutal and probably going to win. The Resistance was brave and probably going to lose. The space in between was where you lived and tried not to attract attention from either side. But something new changed the parameters. Something new meant the calculation wasn't finished yet. And in the Outer Rim, where survival depended on reading unfinished calculations correctly, that mattered enormously. The Knights of Ren did not fail often. This was not because they were infallible. Nothing was infallible a fact that Kylo Ren understood more intimately than most, but because Snoke deployed them selectively against targets that had been assessed, profiled, and determined to be within their operational parameters before the order was ever given. They were not a blunt instrument. They were a precise one, and Snoke's precision was one of the things Kylo had spent years trying to learn from, in the complicated way that students learn from teachers they simultaneously revere and resent. The operation against Ming had been planned over 6 days. 6 days of surveillance data from the vessels watching the Imperatrix. 6 days of signals intelligence and long-range sensor analysis. 6 days of Snoke sitting in his throne room aboard the Supremacy and thinking about the presence in the Quellahan Nebula with the focused attention of a being who did not like unknowns and liked uncontrolled unknowns even less. The plan was straightforward in the way that Snoke's plans always were on the surface. Board the Imperatrix under cover of a scheduled resupply negotiation. Use the Knights to neutralize Ming's guard complement, and take Ming alive. Alive was important. Dead was information destroyed. Alive was information that could be extracted. Kylo had reviewed the plan and said nothing, because saying nothing was what you did when Snoke's plans were also tests, and this one had the particular quality of a test, the way it handed Kylo the lead role, and watched to see what he would do with it. What Kylo did not say, in the silence where his objections would have gone, was that 6 days of surveillance of the Imperatrix had produced surprisingly little usable intelligence about its interior layout, its defensive systems, or its crew complement. The Imperatrix had permitted close observation of its exterior while systematically defeating every attempt to gather information about what was happening inside it. Kylo had flagged this in his internal assessment and then, in the complicated calculus of existing in Snoke's orbit, had decided not to flag it aloud. He flagged it aloud now, standing in the Imperatrix's secondary docking bay with 3 Knights of Run in combat configuration and the cold, specific awareness that something had gone wrong approximately 40 seconds after they breached the airlock. "There are no crew in this section," said Epilek, the knight to his left, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone reporting data rather than expressing concern. "There are no crew anywhere we've been," said Cardo, to his right. Kylo reached out with the Force. The ship was not empty. He could feel presences aboard it, the diffuse warmth of living minds. But they were elsewhere, concentrated in sections they hadn't reached yet, and the sections they had moved through were clean and empty in a way that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. He had the distinct and deeply unwelcome sensation of walking through a space that had been prepared for his arrival. "He knew we were coming," Kylo said. "Surveillance leak?" Apilek asked. "Or he's simply very good at anticipating how people like us respond to situations like the one he created." Kylo moved forward, lightsaber in hand, but not yet ignited, because igniting it would commit to a confrontation he wasn't sure yet was on his terms. Stay together. Don't engage independently. They found Ming in the ship's primary command center, which should have been the most defensible location on the vessel, and instead felt, when Kylo stepped through its doors, like a sitting room. Ming was seated, actually seated for the first time Kylo had seen, behind a console that displayed what appeared to be star charts of the outer rim, annotated in a language Kylo didn't recognize. He was drinking something from a cup that steamed gently. He looked up when they entered with the expression of a man who had been expecting a delivery and was mildly satisfied to see it arrive on schedule. 6 of Ming's Imperial Guard stood arranged around the room's perimeter. They were armed. Kylo could see the weapons energy-based, but of an unfamiliar design, and held in a particular readiness posture that his combat training recognized as prepared but not initiating. They would not move first. That was a choice, not a limitation. "I expected you yesterday," Ming said pleasantly. The delay suggests either that the planning process was more complicated than anticipated, or that someone raised concerns that were overruled. His eyes moved to Kylo with a measuring quality that Kylo was beginning to recognize as Ming's default mode of perception, not hostile assessment, but the continuous, automatic cataloging of useful information. "The second, I think." Kylo ignited his lightsaber. The crossguard flared to life, and the crackling, unstable quality of the blade, a consequence of the cracked kyber crystal at its heart, a consequence of something that had happened to Kylo a long time ago and had never fully healed, filled the command center with red light and the particular sound that made people remember their mortality. Ming looked at the lightsaber with genuine interest. "Remarkable," he said. "A plasma blade stabilized by a crystal matrix. The energy output is extraordinary for something so compact." He set his cup down. "Does it cut through everything?" "Everything I've needed it to," Kylo said. "Useful." Ming stood, unhurried, smoothing his robes. "You're here to take me to Snoke. I'm here to bring you in for a conversation with the Supreme Leader." The distinction between those two things is more semantic than substantive, Ming said. "But I appreciate the courtesy of the framing." He looked at the knights arranged around Kylo, then at his own guard arranged around the room's perimeter, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "Here is my concern with the current situation. If we fight, and we could fight, I won't pretend otherwise, some people in this room will die. Probably some of yours, possibly some of mine, and the outcome will be determined by variables neither of us can fully control in the moment of chaos that combat produces." He folded his hands, the ring visible. "I find that inefficient." "Then come willingly." "I didn't say I was coming," Ming said. "I said fighting was inefficient." He moved to the viewport, a movement that Kylo tracked with the Force, ready for aggression, but which was simply movement, a man crossing to a window to look out at space. "I said, when we last met, that I have no interest in intermediaries. That remains true. Your Supreme Leader wants to meet me. I am willing to meet him. But I will arrive on my own terms in my own time, and I will not be delivered like cargo." He glanced back over his shoulder. "Tell him that." Kylo felt the Force shift, the specific, familiar shift of Snoke pressing through their bond, the not-quite voice that wasn't words but carried meaning with the precision of words. "Take him." Now, Kylo raised his lightsaber, and Ming raised his hand. What happened next was not a Force ability. Kylo was intimately familiar with Force abilities, the push and pull of telekinesis, the invisible pressure of Force compulsion, the dark side techniques that Snoke had taught him and the darker ones he had found in old Sith texts that Snoke didn't know he'd accessed. This was none of those things. The ring on Ming's finger discharged a pulse of energy that was golden and precise and moved through the command center not as an explosion, but as a wave, a structured field that interacted with the Force in a way that Kylo had never encountered and couldn't immediately categorize. His lightsaber didn't go out. His Force connection didn't sever. But both acquired a quality of interference, like a signal receiving static, that made the next half-second feel like moving through resistance rather than air. The Knights of Ren staggered, not falling, but losing the frictionless combat readiness that their training maintained. And in that half-second Ming crossed the distance between them with a speed that was not superhuman, but was very fast for a man of his apparent age and physical build, and took hold of Kylo's lightsaber hand at the wrist. Not to disarm him, not to injure him, just to hold it, with a grip that was surprisingly strong, and to look at Kylo from a distance of approximately 30 centimeters with eyes that were completely calm. "I have been in this situation before," Ming said quietly, just to Kylo, in a voice that didn't carry to the Knights or the Guard. "Not this galaxy, not these weapons, but this situation, a younger man with great power and uncertain purpose, sent by an older man who wants to use that power for his own ends." His grip didn't tighten, but didn't release either. "I have been the older man in that situation more times than I can count." A pause. "I have also once, a very long time ago, been the younger one." Kylo stared at him. The Force was still present, still accessible, the static fading as quickly as it had arrived. The ring's effect was brief, whatever it was. He could throw Ming across the room right now. He could end this. He didn't. "What happened?" Kylo asked, and hated himself slightly for asking, and asked anyway. "When you were the younger one." Ming released his wrist, stepped back. The distance between them returned to something less intimate and more tactical. "I survived," Ming said. The word carried the specific weight of a long answer, compressed into one short one. He turned back to his viewport. "Tell your Supreme Leader I will come to him in 3 days. Tell him I will come alone, without guards, as a gesture of good faith. He glanced back once. And tell him that I am aware of every technique he is likely to attempt and have been for some time. That is not a threat. It is information offered freely, so that we can have an honest conversation rather than an adversarial one. He returned his gaze to the stars. I find honest conversations more productive. They take less time. Kylo sheathed his lightsaber. He stood for a moment in the red-lit command center with the Knights of Run behind him and Ming's guard around the perimeter and the star charts glowing on the console, and the cup of whatever Ming had been drinking still steaming gently on the table, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time and didn't have a clean name for. He felt like he had just been shown something true, without being told what to do with it. He left without another word. Ming listened to the shuttle depart, felt the force shift as the Knights moved away through space, and turned back to his star charts. He picked up his cup. The contents had cooled slightly during the interruption. He drank it anyway. There was a base to establish, a hut to finalize terms with, and a supreme leader to outmaneuver. 3 days was not very long. But Ming had always worked efficiently under pressure. It was, he reflected, one of his better qualities. The New Republic, before the First Order destroyed it, had maintained a Senate that represented thousands of systems across the galaxy. After Starkiller Base fired, what remained of that representation was a scattered collection of surviving senators, planetary governors, diplomatic staff, and political functionaries who had been off-world when the Hosnian system died, and who now existed in the uncomfortable political category of leaders without a polity, people whose authority derived from institutions that no longer existed in any meaningful form, who nonetheless carried the habits, contacts, and institutional knowledge of those institutions in their heads, and could not quite bring themselves to stop behaving like the officials they had been. They were not, as a group, particularly useful to the Resistance. The Resistance needed fighters, ships, and supplies, and former senators provided none of those things directly. What they provided was legitimacy, which was a different kind of currency, valuable in the long run, difficult to spend in the short term, and currently accumulating in a refugee convoy of 14 ships moving slowly through the mid-rim under the protection of a Resistance escort that could barely protect itself. Ming found them on the 3rd day, which was the same day he had promised Snoke he would arrive at the Supremacy, and the scheduling was not accidental. Ming did not make accidental scheduling decisions. The convoy security was adequate by the standards of people who had spent their careers in diplomatic and political environments and had therefore developed their understanding of security primarily through the experience of being protected by other people's security rather than providing it themselves. It detected Ming's shuttle at appropriate range, challenged it correctly, and then spent 12 minutes in confused internal communication when the shuttle's response to the challenge was a personal introduction from someone who was not in any database they could access, and yet spoke with an authority that their Challenger protocols hadn't been designed to process. Ming was patient during the 12 minutes. He had found that patience during security delays communicated confidence more effectively than impatience did, because impatience suggested that the delay was unexpected, while patience suggested that the delay had been anticipated and was simply a step to be waded through. He was admitted to the convoy's flagship, a Mon Calamari diplomatic cruiser called the Sereno Accord, which had been repurposed from its original function as a trade negotiation vessel into its current function as a mobile seat of government for a government that no longer had a seat. Its corridors had the particular atmosphere of spaces designed for ceremony that were now being used for survival. Formal fittings slightly grimy from months of continuous occupation. Protocol droids reprogrammed to manage refugee logistics instead of diplomatic scheduling. A briefing room that had hosted trade ministers, now hosting a collection of people who looked like they hadn't slept properly since Starkiller Base fired. Senator Vanna Deller of Expansion Region, World Syria, met him in that briefing room. She was perhaps 60, white-haired, with the particular exhausted precision of a politician who had spent decades navigating impossible situations and was now navigating an impossible situation while also grieving and running on insufficient sleep. She had been one of 47 senators to vote against the military disarmament resolution that, in retrospect, had left the New Republic fatally vulnerable to the First Order's buildup. She had lost that vote 47 to 812 and had never entirely stopped being angry about it. She looked at Ming across the briefing room table with the assessing gaze of someone who had been looked at by a great many people who wanted things from her and had developed considerable expertise in the assessment. "You're the one from the Quellahan Nebula," she said. "I am," Ming said. He sat without being invited, with the ease of someone for whom sitting without invitation was a reflex too deeply embedded to constitute rudeness. "You've been following developments." "We follow everything. We have very little else to do." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you want from us?" Ming appreciated directness in politicians. It was rare enough to be notable. "I want to understand what you want," he said. "Before I tell you what I want to understand what a collection of former New Republic officials want, now that the New Republic no longer exists to give their wanting any institutional framework." A long pause. Deller looked at him with the expression of someone who had been asked a genuine question and was deciding whether to answer it genuinely or diplomatically, and had concluded that the diplomatic answer was, in this context, the less useful one. "We want it back," she said. "The Republic, not the specific institutions. We're not naive enough to think we can reconstruct exactly what existed. But the idea of it, representation, systems making their own decisions, something that isn't the First Order's boot on everyone's neck indefinitely." She paused. "We want the galaxy to have a future that isn't simply whoever has the largest fleet deciding what everyone else does." "Admirable," Ming said. He meant it in the complicated way that he meant most things, fully, but from a perspective that most people would have found unsettling if they understood it clearly. He had spent 4 centuries doing exactly what she was describing as the thing to be prevented. He had been the boot. He had been the largest fleet. And he had, over those 4 centuries, developed a comprehensive understanding of what that produced, which was not stability, but a continuous cycle of suppression and rebellion that consumed enormous resources and human, or in Mongo's case, humanoid, capital without ever actually resolving the underlying tension. It was, purely from a managerial perspective, inefficient, and currently impossible without resources you don't have. "Yes," Deller said flatly. "I have resources," Ming said. He let that sit for a moment, watching her face process it with the careful neutrality of a politician who had learned not to react to surprising statements until she understood what they meant. Not the resources of a full military force, not yet, but technology, intelligence networks currently being established in the Outer Rim, and the kind of relationship with certain criminal enterprises that provides access to supply chains and personnel that the First Order surveillance doesn't adequately monitor. He folded his hands on the table, mirroring her posture in the way that created unconscious rapport without appearing to do so deliberately. "And I have something else. I have the First Order's attention. They are watching me very carefully, which means that while they are watching me, there are things happening elsewhere that they are watching less carefully." Deller was quiet for a moment. "You're proposing an arrangement." "I'm proposing a conversation," Ming said, with the precision that distinguished the two. "Arrangements require trust, and trust requires time, and neither of us has either yet in sufficient quantity. What I am proposing is that we establish whether our respective interests overlap enough to make further conversation worthwhile." He paused. "I am not a natural ally of democratic institutions, Senator. I want to be honest about that, because dishonesty at this stage would undermine the entire purpose of this meeting." He met her eyes directly. "I am a ruler by inclination, by training, and by centuries of practice. I believe in ordered hierarchy and the application of superior intelligence to the management of large populations. I do not believe that the majority is always right or that representation guarantees good governance." Deller stared at him. "You're describing authoritarianism." "I'm describing my honest political philosophy," Ming said, "which is different from describing what I intend to do in this galaxy, at this moment, in this specific political situation." He leaned forward slightly. "The First Order is also authoritarian. It is authoritarian in the way of people who have mistaken cruelty for strength and compliance for loyalty. It produces misery at scale and calls the misery order. He paused. I have contempt for that approach. Not for moral reasons, though I understand moral objections to it. For practical ones. It doesn't work. It has never worked. It produces the cycle I described: suppression, rebellion, more suppression, more rebellion, until the structure collapses under its own weight, usually taking a great deal of everything else with it. And your alternative? Deller asked. Is not your alternative, Ming said. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But our alternatives share one immediate requirement. The First Order cannot be allowed to consolidate power completely. If it does, neither of us gets to pursue our respective visions for what comes next. He sat back. You need a future to argue about. So do I. That, Senator, is the overlap I am proposing we discuss. The silence in the briefing room had a different quality now. The exhausted, grieving quality that had been in it when Ming arrived had not disappeared. It was too deeply embedded for one conversation to shift it. But something else had entered alongside it. The particular quality of attention that political people gave to arguments they found uncomfortable, but couldn't immediately refute. Deller looked at him for a long time. The resistance won't trust you. The resistance doesn't need to trust me, Ming said. The resistance needs to fight the First Order. Trust is a luxury for after the fighting is done. He stood, smoothing his robes with the unhurried gesture that had punctuated most of his exits. I'm going to meet with Supreme Leader Snoke today. Whatever comes of that meeting, I will send you a full account of it through the same channel I used to reach you initially. He paused at the briefing room door. Not because I need you to know. Because I want you to see how I operate before you decide whether this conversation is worth continuing. He left the Sereno Accord with the same measured pace he had brought onto it. And behind him, Senator Deller sat for a very long time in the briefing room designed for trade negotiations, thinking about a man who had just described himself as an authoritarian emperor and somehow made it sound like the beginning of an honest conversation rather than the end of one. She sent a message to Leia Organa. The message was longer than Merrick's 3 sentences and considerably more complicated. Its final line was, I don't know what he is, General, but I think he might be the most honest liar I've ever met. And in the current situation, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. The Supremacy was the largest ship Ming had ever seen, and Ming had seen ships that could swallow small moons. It was 17 kilometers of angular First Order engineering, a flying wedge of military-industrial philosophy made physical. The belief that scale itself was an argument, that the sheer mass of a thing could function as ideology, could say to everyone who saw it, resistance is not merely futile, it is absurd. Ming had built monuments on Mongo for exactly the same reason, had commissioned architecture specifically designed to make individual beings feel small in the presence of his authority. He recognized the methodology in the Supremacies designed the way a painter recognizes technique in another painter's brushstrokes. He arrived alone as promised, in a shuttle that Tarnak had spent 3 days arguing against sending, and Ming had spent 3 days not changing his mind about sending. The argument was reasonable. Walking into the seat of First Order power, without guards, without weapons beyond his ring, without any leverage beyond his own capabilities, and whatever respect the previous encounters had accumulated. And Ming had listened to all of it with the patience he extended to good arguments before overruling them. The point was not that Tarnak was wrong. The point was that arriving with guards would tell Snoke that Ming felt he needed them, and Ming had not felt he needed guards in approximately 3 centuries, and he was not going to start communicating otherwise now. He was met in the Supremacy's primary docking bay by an escort of 6 Praetorian guards, red-armored, armed, ceremonial in function, but genuinely dangerous in capability, a detail Ming had researched before arriving. He walked with them through corridors that had been designed to communicate power to the people who served in them daily, which meant they communicated it even more forcefully to someone encountering them for the first time. He cataloged everything. Guard positions, corridor intersections, the spacing of blast doors, the locations of internal communication panels, the subtle variations in lighting that indicated different security zones. He filed it all in the meticulous internal architecture that served him where other beings used notes and data storage, and by the time the escort delivered him to the throne room doors, he had a working map of the Supremacy's primary command levels that would have been valuable intelligence to approximately everyone currently fighting the First Order. The throne room itself he had partly anticipated from Kylo's description and partly not. The scale was right, enormous, designed for audience rather than conversation. The throne elevated to ensure the physical subordination of everyone who entered. The quality of light was something he hadn't anticipated. Gold warm at the throne, darkening toward the room's edges, as though light itself had been convinced to participate in the hierarchy. The Praetorian guards arranged around the room's perimeter were anticipated. The figure on the throne was not, precisely, what he had expected. Snoke looked ancient in a way that was difficult to categorize, that sat outside the normal registers of age, not the aged quality of biological beings who had simply lived long lives, but something else, something that suggested the appearance of age had been arrived at by a different route than time alone. He was large in the throne, wrapped in gold, and his presence in the Force was exactly what Ming's psychic faculties had mapped during their earlier encounters. Vast, cold, disciplined, and accustomed to being the most powerful thing in any given room. Ming stopped at the appropriate distance, which he had calculated in advance, as close enough to communicate confidence, and far enough to communicate that he was not making tactical concessions he hadn't chosen deliberately. He inclined his head slightly, not a bow, an acknowledgement of presence. "You came alone," Snoke said. His voice in person was the same voice Ming had felt as force pressure during their remote encounters, deep, resonant, carrying harmonics that were designed to bypass conscious processing and speak directly to the parts of minds that responded to power before reason could intervene. Ming had spent considerable time preparing for this voice. "As promised," Ming said, "I find that following through on specific commitments early in a relationship establishes the credibility to be disbelieved on specific things later, when that becomes useful." He paused. That was an honest statement of methodology, not a warning. Snoke's expression moved through something that might, in a less controlled face, have been amusement. "Sit," he said. There was no chair. Ming noted its absence without reacting to it. The absent chair was a power move so old that Ming had been using it himself before most of this galaxy's current civilizations had developed writing. He remained standing, which was the only response that didn't concede the point, and Snoke's expression moved again through something that was more clearly appreciation this time. "You are very old," Snoke said. "Not a question." "By the standards of most species, yes," Ming said. "My longevity is a consequence of technology rather than biology, a distinction that matters less in practical terms than it does philosophically. And your world, your empire." Snoke's eyes moved over Ming with the force-enhanced perception of a being who read people the way other beings read text, continuously, automatically, extracting layers of meaning from posture and breath and the microscopic tells that most people didn't know they were producing. "You ruled it completely. For several centuries, yes. And yet you are here," Snoke said. The words were mild. Their implication was not. Ming recognized the technique. The question framed as observation, the suggestion of failure embedded in apparent neutrality, designed to provoke either defensiveness or explanation, both of which would give Snoke information. He answered it the way he answered most things, with the truth selected carefully. "A dimensional anomaly produced by a weapons test," Ming said. "Not a defeat. A miscalculation with an unexpected variable. The distinction matters." "Does it?" Snoke asked. "The outcome is the same. You are here and your empire is there, and you cannot currently return to it." "The outcome is temporarily the same," Ming said. "Outcomes change." Snoke was quiet for a moment. The force in the room shifted in a way that Ming's psychic senses registered as a change in pressure. Snoke reaching out, not with the direct probe he had attempted before, but with something subtler, something that moved along the edges of Ming's consciousness, like water finding the contours of a vessel. Testing rather than penetrating, looking for the shape of the defenses without directly engaging them. Ming let him look. He had prepared specific things to be findable, not false information, which skilled psychics could usually identify as constructed, but selectively arranged true information, the careful curation of what was findable versus what was not. If Snoke was good enough, he would find the surface layer. Ming's genuine confidence, his genuine assessment of the First Order as a flawed structure, his genuine interest in the galaxy's power dynamics. He would not find the three specific things Ming had placed below that surface layer in a vault whose door he had spent 3 days constructing. "You want something from this galaxy," Snoke said. "I want to understand it first," Ming said. "I have never conquered territory I didn't understand. It produces unstable results." "Conquer," Snoke repeated. The word sat between them. "Eventually," Ming said. "I am not in a position to conquer anything immediately, and claiming otherwise would be both dishonest and strategically unsound. I am in a position to be useful to the right partner while I build toward a position of greater independence." He held Snoke's gaze without effort. "That is the honest version of what I want from this meeting." Snoke leaned forward slightly in his throne. "And you believe I am the right partner?" "I believe you are the most powerful single entity currently operating in this galaxy," Ming said. "Whether that makes you the right partner depends on what partnership with you would actually entail, which is what I am here to determine." A pause. "What do you want from me?" The directness of it, the simple reversal, the refusal to wait for Snoke to define the terms, produced another shift in the room's force atmosphere. Not hostility, something more like recalibration. "Your technology," Snoke said. "Your psychic capabilities. The knowledge of what exists beyond this galaxy's dimensional boundaries." He paused. "And your obedience. The first 3 are negotiable," Ming said. "The 4th is not available." "Everything is available at sufficient cost," Snoke said. "That is true for most beings," Ming agreed. "I am not most beings. My obedience has not been available at any cost for approximately 370 years, and I do not expect that to change in the near term." He tilted his head slightly. "What I can offer in place of obedience is alignment. We want different things ultimately, but those different things do not currently conflict. The First Order's dominance of this galaxy would create a stable power structure that I could work within while pursuing my own objectives. My technology and capabilities, applied to First Order problems, would accelerate your consolidation significantly." He paused. "Alignment without obedience. A genuine partnership between equals, rather than a master-client relationship that one of us would spend the entire duration trying to convert into dominance." The silence that followed was the longest silence of the meeting. Snoke sat with it, which was itself information. A being who rejected the proposition immediately would not sit with it, and a being who sat with it was calculating, which meant the proposition had merit he was assessing. When Snoke spoke, it was not to accept or reject. "Kylo Ren," he said. "What about him?" Ming asked. "You spoke to him privately during the boarding attempt," Snoke said. "I felt the conversation through our bond afterward, the shape of it, even without the content. What did you say to him?" Ming considered this for a moment, not the deliberating pause of someone uncertain what to say, but the selecting pause of someone deciding which true thing to say. "I told him something about myself," Ming said. "A long time ago. Something I recognized in him." He met Snoke's eyes directly. "I would not repeat it to you. Not because it was strategically sensitive. Because it was personal, and personal things shared in confidence are personal things shared in confidence, regardless of the political situation of the parties involved." The temperature in the room did not literally change, but something in it did. Snoke looked at Ming with an expression that had moved through several things and arrived at something that was not quite respect. Snoke was not a being who arrived at respect easily, but was its structural neighbor. "We will speak again," Snoke said. "In 3 days. I will have specific proposals." Ming inclined his head again, the same slight acknowledgement he had offered at the beginning. "I look forward to it," he said. He turned to go. "Ming." Snoke's voice stopped him at the throne room doors. "The resistance contact. The convoy." Ming turned back. "Yes. I know about it," Snoke said. "I assumed you would," Ming said. "I didn't conceal it." "No," Snoke said slowly. "You didn't." Another pause. "Why?" "Because concealing it would have suggested I was choosing sides," Ming said. "And I haven't chosen sides." I have had conversations. There is a difference. He held Snoke's gaze one final time across the length of the enormous throne room, across the gold light and the red guards and the vast crushing architecture of First-Order power, with the absolute composure of someone who had stood in rooms like this one for centuries, and had never yet found one that made him feel small. I always tell the truth about my conversations, Supreme Leader. It is my deceptions that I keep private. He left. Behind him, Snoke sat in his throne for a long time, and the force around him was very still, and his expression was the expression of a being doing arithmetic on a problem that had more variables than he had initially calculated. In the corridor, surrounded by his Praetorian escort, Ming permitted himself exactly one thing he had not permitted himself in the throne room: a breath. Slow, controlled. The breath of someone releasing a tension that had been held for the duration of a performance that had gone, by his assessment, approximately as well as it could have gone. The vault had held. The three things below the surface layer had remained unfound. What Snoke had not found was the complete intelligence picture Ming had assembled of the Supremacy's internal layout. The network of outer rim contacts, now 3 days further along in their development than they had been when Ming arrived. And the specific, detailed plan that Ming had been constructing since approximately 6 hours after arriving in this galaxy, which had nothing to do with partnership and everything to do with patience. He had told Snoke the truth. He simply hadn't told him all of it. He never did. Starkiller Base had been firing for 11 seconds when Ming changed his mind. Not about the plan. The plan remained intact, its components moving through their assigned sequences with the precision that came from 3 days of meticulous preparation and 4 centuries of experience turning preparation into execution. The outer rim network that Vross had helped build was operational. The intelligence he had fed to both the Resistance and Snoke, different intelligence, carefully selected, each piece true and each piece incomplete in ways that served Ming's purposes, had done its work. The First Order's attention was distributed across 3 separate concerns: the Resistance's increased activity in the mid-rim, a series of unexplained disruptions to First Order supply lines in the outer rim that Ming's people had been quietly engineering for 5 days, and the ongoing assessment of Ming himself, which Snoke was conducting with the focused intensity of a being who had correctly identified that he was being managed, but had not yet correctly identified how. What Ming changed his mind about was the firing itself. He was watching it from the Imperatrix S primary command center, the event visible on long-range sensors as an energy signature so vast that it registered as an astronomical event rather than a weapons discharge. A beam of collected stellar energy crossing the galaxy at speeds that should have been impossible, targeted at a system he had no particular attachment to, killing people he had never met in numbers that his mind processed with the cold arithmetic of someone who had, over 4 centuries, ordered deaths at scale himself. He had ordered deaths at scale himself. This was true. He had done it without hesitation when it served his purposes, had built an empire on the understanding that power required the willingness to apply force absolutely when challenged. He was not a man who flinched from necessary violence or who confused sentiment with strategic clarity. But there was a difference between necessary violence and this. What Starkiller Base represented was not a military instrument. It was a philosophical statement. It said, "We will destroy everything rather than accept the existence of opposition." Ming had made similar statements in his time, in the early centuries before he had learned, through the expensive education of repeated rebellion and structural collapse, that statements of that kind were not strength. They were the declaration of a being who had confused the elimination of opposition with the elimination of the conditions that produced opposition, and who would therefore spend eternity eliminating opposition and never understand why it kept returning. The Hosnian system was already dead. He knew that. He had known it was coming. Snoke's proposals from their second meeting had included, as a demonstration of First-Order capability, the advanced knowledge of the firing, offered with the casual confidence of someone showing a prospective partner what they were signing on to. Ming had received that information and had made a series of calculations about what to do with it that he was not entirely satisfied with in retrospect. He could not have stopped it. That was the honest assessment. He had been 5 days into building an outer rim network, operating from a damaged ship with a depleted fleet complement, with no established military relationships in the galaxy and no leverage over First-Order command decisions. The variables had not supported intervention. He told himself this clearly and completely, and then he set it aside, because self-recrimination was a luxury for people who had time to afford it, and Ming had never had that time. What the firing changed was the timeline. He had planned for Snoke to spend another 2 to 3 weeks in the managed assessment phase, during which Ming would continue building resources and relationships, while appearing to be conducting the preliminary negotiations of a potential alliance. The firing accelerated the Resistance's crisis beyond what his original timeline had accounted for. Leia Organa's people were now fighting for survival, in a way they hadn't been a week ago. The First Order's confidence, already substantial, had expanded into something that would soon become the overconfidence that large powers always developed in the aftermath of overwhelming demonstrations of force. And Snoke, who had shown Ming a preview of the firing as a partnership demonstration, would now expect some response from his prospective partner, some indication that Ming had received the message and adjusted his position accordingly. Ming called Tarnak. Move the fleet to these coordinates. He transmitted a location, a system in the outer rim that his network had identified as a viable staging point, far enough from First-Order primary patrol routes to be defensible and close enough to several key hyperspace lanes to be strategically flexible. Quietly, one ship at a time, staggered departure intervals. I want no hyperspace signature pattern that reads as a fleet movement. Yes, my lord. Tarnak paused, which he rarely did. The Resistance signal. There's been an increase in traffic volume in the last 2 hours. They've found something, a planet, we think, a base location. They're converging. Crait, Ming said. His intelligence network had flagged the Resistance's movement toward the former rebel outpost 3 hours ago, before the firing, when it had been a precaution rather than a desperate refuge. They're cornered. The First Order fleet is already moving toward the system, Tarnak confirmed. Ming was quiet for a moment. The star charts on his console showed the First Order's fleet disposition, updated through the intelligence channels he had built into the relationship with Snoke, channels that Snoke believed he controlled and that Ming had, with considerable technical ingenuity, made bidirectional in ways Snoke had not noticed. He could see the trap closing, an entire fleet descending on a planet with a single exit point, a small resistance force with limited resources and no reinforcements coming. The mathematical certainty of what happened when those two things met expressed cleanly in the sensor data. He thought about Leia Organa, whom he had never met. He thought about Senator Deller, whom he had met once in a briefing room on a diplomatic cruiser, and who had called him the most honest liar she'd ever encountered, which was the most accurate description of him he had heard in several decades. He thought about Kylo Ren, to whom he had said something true in a room full of armed people, and who had not attacked him afterward, which Ming chose to interpret as a form of gratitude even if it was more complicated than that. He thought less sentimentally and more strategically about what happened to his own position if the Resistance was eliminated completely at Crait. Without the Resistance, the First Order's opposition collapsed. Without opposition, the First Order consolidated. A consolidated First Order was a much harder obstacle than a First Order still fighting a war. Ming needed the conflict to continue, not for moral reasons, though he had arrived over the last several days at something approaching a moral position on the subject, but because a galaxy at war was a galaxy with open variables, and open variables were what Ming worked with. He needed the Resistance to survive Crait. The problem was the method: direct military intervention. Sending Imperatrix and her remaining escort to Crait to engage the First Order fleet was not a viable option. His fleet was still damaged, still outnumbered, and direct confrontation with the First Order's primary military force would result in his destruction before he was positioned to matter. He needed to act without acting directly. He needed to find the lever that moved the situation without requiring him to be the force that moved it. He spent 11 minutes thinking. Then he opened 3 communication channels simultaneously. The first went to Vross the Hutt through the encrypted channel they had established. The message was brief: coordinates a time window, And the words, everything you have. Ross had been building toward this deployment for days, had assembled the mercenary and smuggling fleet that Ming's Outer Rim network represented, had been waiting for the moment Ming identified as the right one. This was the right one, or close enough to it. The second went to Senator Deller, through the Resistance adjacent channel. This message was longer. Intelligence on First Order fleet positioning around Crait, the specific disposition of their surface assault forces, and 3 tactical vulnerabilities in the blockade formation that Ming's analysis had identified and that a sufficiently creative pilot or commander might be able to exploit. He sent it without explanation or attribution, as raw intelligence, because intelligence was more valuable than the identity of its source, and Deller was smart enough to use it without needing to understand where it came from. The third channel was the one he hadn't fully decided to open until the moment he opened it. It connected to the tracking signal embedded in a communication device he had given Kylo Ren during their second meeting, given under the pretense of establishing a direct communication line between them that bypassed Snoke's monitoring. The device did establish that line. It also, less obviously, established a locator ping that Ming's systems had been tracking ever since. The message he sent through it was 4 words. Choose before it's done. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Kylo Ren was intelligent enough to understand what 4 words from Ming meant at the moment that Crait was happening. And whatever Kylo did with that understanding was Kylo's choice to make, which was precisely the point. Ming had told him something true in a room full of armed people. He had told him that he had once been the younger one, the powerful person sent by an older and more powerful person to execute an agenda that wasn't his own. He had told him that he survived it. He had not told him how, because the how was different for everyone, and the telling would have made it advice rather than information. And Ming did not give advice. He gave information and let people build their own architecture from it. What happened at Crait happened without Ming present. He was in the Imperatrix S command center, watching sensor data from long range, tracking the movement of forces through the intelligence channels he had built, monitoring the 3 communication threads he had deployed with the focused attention of a strategist reading a battle from a hilltop. He watched Ross's mercenary fleet, ragged, profit-motivated, held together by the combination of Ming's compensation and the implied threat of his displeasure, harassed the First Order's supply lines at the edge of the Crait system, not enough to turn the battle, but enough to complicate it, enough to draw 3 First Order destroyers out of the primary formation and into a pursuit action that opened a gap in the blockade that hadn't been there before. He watched the resistance move through that gap, or some of them did. Not all. The mathematics of what happened at Crait were not kind mathematics. They were the mathematics of people fighting a much larger force with much less. And even with the complications Ming had introduced, the losses were substantial and the survival was narrow, and the future it produced was fragile in the way that all futures built from wreckage were fragile. But the resistance survived. What remained of it found its way through the gap and into hyperspace. And behind them, the First Order was intact and furious, and not entirely sure what had complicated its perfect siege. And Snoke. Ming received the report about Snoke 17 minutes after the resistance escaped. He read it twice. Then he set it down and sat very still for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a supreme leader who had been the most powerful force user in the galaxy and was now dead, apparently at the hands of the young man to whom Ming had sent 4 words, and the young man who was now something Ming hadn't fully calculated for, the most powerful force user in the galaxy, operating without a master for the first time in his life. Ming had told him something true. He had sent him 4 words at a critical moment. He had not intended to be responsible for what Kylo Ren decided to do with either of those things, and he was not responsible for it in any simple causal sense. And yet, he thought about the ring on his finger. He thought about the 3 things he had kept hidden from Snoke in the throne room vault. He thought about the plan that was now operating in a galaxy where one of its 3 primary variables had just been eliminated and replaced with something new. He thought for approximately 45 seconds about whether this complicated his position or simplified it. He concluded, both simultaneously, in ways that would take time to fully map. He picked up the communication to Tarnak. Change of plans, he said. Hold position. I need to rethink the next phase. Tarnak, wisely, asked no questions. Outside the Imperatrix's viewport, the galaxy was doing what galaxies did in the aftermath of massive events, continuing in all its complicated abundance, while the people in it tried to understand what had changed and what it meant and what they were supposed to do next. Ming understood this feeling. He had felt it in various galaxies worth of context many times before. He picked up his star charts and started rethinking. 6 weeks after Crait, the galaxy had settled into the particular suspended quality of a conflict that had reached its hinge point. The moment after a decisive event and before its consequences had fully propagated through every system and faction and individual life that would eventually feel them. The First Order held more territory than it ever had. The resistance existed in numbers that could fit aboard a single vessel. The political architecture of the new republic remained rubble. And in the Outer Rim, in a system that appeared on most First Order navigation charts as uninhabited and strategically irrelevant, the Imperatrix sat repaired, resupplied, and fully operational for the first time since the dimensional transit that had brought her here. Ming stood at his viewport and looked at his fleet. Not the fleet he had arrived with. That fleet was repaired but still diminished, still carrying the structural losses of the transit. The fleet he looked at now was larger, assembled over 6 weeks from the Outer Rim network that Voss had helped build, supplemented by 3 mercenary organizations that had accepted Ming's terms, 2 independent military contractors who had recognized which way the wind was shifting, and a collection of smaller vessels crewed by people from a dozen species who had in common only that they had decided, through various routes and for various reasons, that the emerging new order in this galaxy was not one they wanted to live under, and that Ming represented, if not an alternative they fully understood, at least a third option that wasn't defined by either side of the existing conflict. It was not the fleet of a galactic conqueror. Not yet. It was the fleet of a serious regional power, capable of defending itself and projecting force selectively, large enough to matter in specific engagements, and not yet large enough to survive a full First Order military response. Ming understood the distinction clearly and held it without impatience, because impatience had never been his limitation. His limitation, across 4 centuries, had occasionally been the assumption that his intelligence made him invulnerable to the specific forms of uncertainty that other people were vulnerable to. He was working on that. The communication from Kylo Ren, from Supreme Leader Kylo Ren, as he now was, a title that sat on him with the visible discomfort of something that fit the dimensions, but not the weight, had arrived 4 days after Crait and had been, characteristically, for words. What did you know? Ming had replied with more than 4 words for once. He had replied honestly, which was what he did in communications where honesty served a purpose. And in this case the purpose was establishing the terms of a relationship with the galaxy's new most powerful Force user before that Force user decided, from incomplete information, what relationship to have with Ming. He had told Kylo that he had known Snoke was manipulable through the right emotional pressure applied at the right moment, and that the 4 words had been information about timing rather than instruction about action. He had told him that he had not known what Kylo would choose to do, only that Kylo was someone who made genuine choices rather than executing predetermined responses, and that genuine choices at critical moments were what changed situations. He had told him that he was sorry for the losses at Crait, which was not something he said often and meant with the particular limited sincerity of someone who was sorry about collateral damage while remaining clear-eyed about the strategic necessity that had produced it. Kylo had not responded to that message. The silence was information Ming was still processing. The more immediately pressing communication had come from Leia Organa, who had apparently decided that the fragmented intelligence picture she had assembled about Ming over the preceding weeks was sufficient to warrant a direct conversation. The request had come through Senator Deller, through the same channel Ming had been using to feed intelligence to the Resistance-adjacent network, and it had been characteristically direct. The General would like to speak with you. She prefers honesty to diplomacy, which he says you'll find is a recommendation rather than a warning. Ming had found it both. He met Leia Organa in a location that neither of them controlled, a neutral station in a system that belonged, loosely, to a trading consortium that had been carefully cultivating relationships with everyone and committing to no one since the fall of the New Republic, which made it the most genuinely neutral ground available. Leia arrived with two people he recognized from intelligence files, a former stormtrooper, and a young woman whose force sensitivity was legible even to Ming's non-force-connected psychic faculties, radiating with the particular intensity of someone who had come to it late and was still in the process of understanding what it meant. She left them outside the meeting room, which told Ming what he needed to know about Leia Organa's assessment of her own capabilities. She was smaller than he had expected. He had expected someone who commanded the kind of loyalty she commanded to be physically imposing, and she was not. She was a small woman of late middle age who moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy across a very long war, and whose eyes, when they found his across the meeting room, were the eyes of someone who had looked at a great deal of darkness without flinching and without being diminished by it. Ming sat across from her with a feeling, unusual enough to register, of sitting across from an equal. Not an equal in power, not currently. She had almost nothing, and he had more than nothing, though less than enough. Equal in the specific sense of someone who had been doing the same kind of work for a comparable length of time, and had arrived at a comparable level of understanding about what that work cost and what it produced. "You saved some of us at Crait," she said. "Not thank you. Not yet. I complicated the First Order's siege enough to open a gap," Ming said. "You saved yourselves." The distinction is operationally important. "Why?" she asked. "Because I need you to understand that what I did at Crait was strategic rather than altruistic," Ming said. "I needed you to survive because a galaxy without organized opposition to the First Order is a galaxy the First Order consolidates, and a consolidated First Order is a significantly larger problem, for me, than a First Order still fighting a war." He paused. "That is the honest answer. The other answer, which is also true but which I would not normally lead with, is that I have spent the last 6 weeks developing a perspective on this galaxy's situation that I did not have when I arrived, and that perspective has produced something in me that I am not entirely comfortable calling a moral position, but which functions like one." Leia looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of moral position?" "The First Order needs to be destroyed," Ming said. "Not contained. Not negotiated with. Not managed as a permanent feature of the political landscape. Destroyed comprehensively and replaced with something that, whatever its other characteristics, does not operate on the principle that compliance obtained through fear is an acceptable substitute for genuine social order." He met her eyes. "I have operated on that principle myself for a very long time in my own galaxy. I am not offering you a reformed character. I am offering you an honest assessment of what is strategically necessary in this specific situation, which happens to align with what is morally necessary. And I find that alignment more compelling than either argument alone." "And after?" Leia asked. "After the First Order is gone, what do you want?" "After is a long time away," Ming said. "I don't make commitments about after when before is this complicated." He folded his hands on the table. "What I can tell you is that I have no interest in what remains of this galaxy's population once the First Order is eliminated. My objectives are in my own galaxy, which I intend to return to once I have the technological means to reopen the dimensional transit that brought me here. This galaxy is a problem I am solving on the way to solving my own problem." "That's not reassuring," Leia said. "It's honest," Ming said, "which you were told I prefer to reassuring." She almost smiled. "What do you need from us?" "Intelligence on First Order command structure since Snoke's death," Ming said. "Specifically, the internal power dynamics that have shifted with Kylo Ren's ascension and the degree to which the military command structure has remained stable or fractured in the transition." He paused. "And I need to know what you're planning, not because I intend to control it, but because I need to know where the pressure is being applied so that I can apply complementary pressure rather than duplicating effort or creating conflicts between our respective operations." Leia was quiet for a moment. "You're proposing a military alliance." "I'm proposing an information-sharing arrangement with coordinated tactical objectives," Ming said. "The distinction matters because an alliance implies a unified command structure, which neither of us is going to accept, and because allies make moral commitments to each other's causes that I am not in a position to make honestly. He paused. What I can commit to is this. My objectives will not conflict with yours in the near term. And in the near term, I will share intelligence and apply military force in ways that complement your operations. When our objectives diverge, I will tell you before I act rather than after. That's a very limited commitment, she said. It's a commitment I can keep, Ming said. I find that limited commitments kept are more valuable than large commitments broken. Leia looked at him for a long time in the quiet of the neutral meeting room, with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that still had to happen present in the silence between them, and Ming found, sitting across from her, that he was doing something unusual. He was waiting for her assessment without having already decided how to manage it. He was genuinely uncertain what she would conclude, and genuinely interested in the conclusion. And the combination of uncertainty and genuine interest was rare enough in his experience that he noticed it. My people will want to know what you are, she said finally. Not politically. What you actually are. Tell them I am someone who has spent a very long time being the worst thing in the room, Ming said, and who has arrived in a room where something worse than me already exists, and who has therefore found it strategically advantageous to be temporarily useful. He paused. Tell them that is not an endorsement of my character. It is an accurate description of my situation. Leia stood. I'll be in contact through Deller's channel within 48 hours. I'll be here, Ming said. She moved to the door, then stopped. One question. Yes. Kylo Ren, she said. The name carried everything names carry when the person speaking them has a complicated relationship with the person named. Did you know what he was going to do? Ming considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I knew what he was capable of, he said. I did not know what he would choose. There is a version of him that chooses differently. He held her gaze. I think you know that too. Something moved through her face, something old and unresolved and not ready to be resolved. And then she nodded, once, and left. Ming sat alone in the neutral meeting room for a while after she left, looking at the table between the two empty chairs, thinking about what had been said and what had not been said, and what the next phase of a plan that now had more variables than it had started with was going to require. He thought about Mongo, which was out there somewhere beyond the dimensional boundary, continuing without him in ways he couldn't monitor and couldn't control, which was an experience he had not had in 4 centuries, and which produced in him something he had almost forgotten the texture of. Something that might, in someone with a less comprehensive vocabulary for their own internal states, have been called loneliness. He put away. He stood. He smoothed his robes. He had work to do. The galaxy that Ming the Merciless had fallen into was not the galaxy he would have chosen, had choosing been available to him. It was too large, too complicated, too saturated with an invisible energy field that pressed against his consciousness like weather. Too populated with beings whose relationship to power was filtered through philosophies he found simultaneously fascinating and inefficient. It was a galaxy that had been at war with itself for so long that war had become the medium through which it understood everything else: love, politics, history, identity, all of it read through the lens of conflict, because conflict was the only constant that had outlasted every empire and every peace and every attempt to establish something permanent in the perpetual churn of galactic civilization. Ming understood this galaxy. That was the thing that had surprised him most in the weeks since his arrival. Not the technology, not the force, not the scale of the political conflict or the complexity of the faction dynamics or the particular brand of ruthlessness that the First Order had refined into institutional policy. What had surprised him was how quickly he had understood it. Not the surface details, those required learning, required the careful intelligence gathering and analysis he had applied from the first hour, but the underlying structure, the grammar of how power moved and accumulated and corrupted and collapsed in this galaxy was the same grammar he had been reading for 4 centuries in his own. Different vocabulary, same syntax. He had arrived with 11 ships and 40,000 soldiers, and a ring on his finger that could bend minds and discharge energy in precisely calibrated bursts, and he had survived his first 6 weeks in an unknown galaxy by doing what he had always done. By understanding the room, he was in faster than the room understood him. He had outthought the First Order's initial containment attempt. He had carved a position in the Outer Rim's criminal architecture by offering genuine value rather than simply demanding compliance. He had walked into Snoke's throne room alone and walked out with his 3 most important secrets intact. He had fed intelligence to 3 separate parties simultaneously and managed the information ecology of each relationship with the precision of someone who had been doing exactly this for centuries. He had also, and this was the thing he returned to most often in the quiet hours when the Imperatrix ran on minimal crew and the galaxy outside his viewport was simply dark and vast and still, made choices that he had not made for a very long time. Not strategic choices. He always made strategic choices. That was simply the continuous operation of his intelligence against the problems before him. But choices that had a different quality to them. Choices were the strategic calculus, and something else had arrived at the same answer through different routes, and the convergence had produced decisions that felt, in retrospect, different from purely strategic ones. He had warned Kylo Ren. He had fed the Resistance intelligence. He had complicated the siege at Crait. He had sat across from Leia Organa and told her true things he had not needed to tell her. He told himself these were strategic decisions, and they were also something else, and he was honest enough with himself, in the private vault where he kept the things he didn't show anyone, to acknowledge that the something else existed even if he wasn't prepared to name it. The Force, he had concluded, was doing something to him, not converting him, not drawing him toward the light side in the way the galaxy's mythology suggested it should. He had no Force sensitivity, no midi-chlorian connection, no access to that particular channel of the galaxy's ambient energy. But the Force permeated everything in this galaxy, pressed against every consciousness that existed within it, and Ming's consciousness, stripped of the psychic static of Mongo's own ambient energy and recalibrated to function in this new environment, was more permeable than it had been. The Force didn't speak to him, but he could feel the shape of what it spoke to in others, could feel the way it moved through people and situations and choices, and that feeling had accumulated over 6 weeks into something that was changing, slowly, and without his full consent, the way he read the room. He did not find this entirely unwelcome. That, too, surprised him. The First Order remained. Kylo Ren remained. Supreme Leader now, carrying the weight of that title, with the visible difficulty of someone who had taken a step whose consequences extended further than the step itself. The Resistance remained fragile and determined in the particular combination that had, historically, proven more durable than it had any right to be. The Outer Rim network remained growing, extending its reach into systems that the First Order's attention hadn't yet touched. Senator Deller and her convoy of displaced politicians remained, and Ming had begun, carefully and without announcement, feeding their network the kind of administrative and logistical intelligence that would allow the skeleton of a post-First Order political structure to begin forming before there was anything to structure yet. This was, he acknowledged to himself, a long game. He was good at long games. He had been playing them for 4 centuries and had, on balance, won more than he had lost, though the losses had occasionally been catastrophic enough to require the reconstruction of entire planetary power structures from the ground up, which was the kind of experience that either destroyed you or taught you things that couldn't be learned any other way. What he had not resolved, and what sat at the back of his calculations like an unread variable, was Kylo Ren. The 4 words he had sent had produced Snoke's death, which had produced the current power vacuum at the First Order's apex, which had produced a situation that was more strategically complex and potentially more exploitable than the one that had existed before. He had not planned for Snoke's death specifically. He had planned for Kylo's choice, whatever it turned out to be, because Kylo was someone who made genuine choices, and genuine choices were unpredictable in the specific way that made them interesting. The death had been one possible outcome. There had been others. What he had also not planned for was the question Leia had asked him afterward. There is a version of him that chooses differently. He had said that because it was true, and because Leia deserved the truth of it, and because the truth of it was also, in its way, an answer to the question he had not been asked, but which had been present in the room, whether Ming regretted what his 4 words had set in motion. He did not regret it. He regretted that it had been necessary. The distinction he had found was the closest he was currently able to come to a moral position, and he was willing to sit with the inadequacy of that for the time being. Mongo was out there. He had not forgotten this. He had built the Imperatrix's scientific division into a serious research program focused on dimensional transit theory, had recruited 3 of the galaxy's most capable theoretical physicists with offers that combined compensation, intellectual freedom, and the implicit understanding that declining was not a comfortable option. They were making progress, not fast progress. The problem was genuinely difficult, operating at the intersection of hyperspace physics and dimensional mechanics in ways that neither field had previously had to address. But real progress, measurable progress, the kind that suggested a working solution within a time frame that Ming found acceptable rather than urgent. He would go home. He was certain of this. The certainty was not hope. Hope was, for people who weren't sure, it was simply accurate projection from current data. He would go home, and he would go home having done something in this galaxy that he had not done in a very long time in his own. He would have mattered in ways that weren't simply about Ming. He was not prepared to examine that conclusion too closely yet, but he was not prepared to discard it either. He stood at the viewport of the Imperatrix, in the system that appeared on most charts as uninhabited and irrelevant, looking at the fleet he had built from nothing in 6 weeks, and beyond it at the galaxy that had not chosen him, and had not been chosen by him, and had nevertheless become, for the duration of whatever time remained before the dimensional transit opened again, his problem to help solve. He put his hand in his pocket. His fingers found a ring, which he had removed for the first time in decades, just for this moment, just to hold rather than wear. He turned it in his fingers in the dark. The energy inside it pulsed gently, patient, waiting. The First Order was not going to destroy this galaxy. Not because the resistance was strong enough to stop it alone. It wasn't, not yet, and not because the Force would intervene in the way the Jedi mythology suggested it should. He had no evidence that the Force made guarantees about outcomes rather than simply providing the medium through which outcomes were reached. The First Order was not going to destroy this galaxy because Ming the Merciless was in it. And Ming the Merciless did not permit the destruction of things he had decided were his to deal with. He had decided. He put the ring back on. It pulsed once, gold and certain, against his finger. Outside, the fleet waited. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Resistance was planning. Somewhere, Kylo Ren was sitting with the weight of a throne that didn't fit. Somewhere, Senator Deller was building the architecture of a future that didn't exist yet. Somewhere, Vross the Hutt was counting credits and wondering what he had gotten himself into. And in a galaxy far, far away from Mongo, an emperor without an empire looked out at the dark between the stars and found it, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely interesting. He had work to do. He always did.